The carriage wheels stopped turning, and Eleanor Hartley's hands were shaking before her feet even touched the ground. She had known this day would come since she was 16 years old, since the afternoon her father sat her down at the kitchen table at Hartley Grange and told her, in a voice that cracked with shame, that their family had nothing left but her. Not land, not money, not even the roof over their heads for much longer, only her, and whatever value a marriage to her might bring. Now she stood outside Blackmore Hall, a house so large it seemed to swallow the sky, and she understood for the first time just how small that value truly was. The Dowager Duchess Margaret Camden stood at the top of the stone steps, dressed in deep gray silk, her spine straight as a blade. She did not smile. She did not move to greet her son's bride. She simply watched, the way a woman watches something she has already decided she does not want. Beside her stood a younger woman, with golden curls and a mouth shaped for cruelty, though it was currently arranged into something like a smile. This was Priscilla Vane, cousin to the Duke, and within the first 10 seconds of meeting her, Eleanor understood exactly what kind of welcome she was about to receive. "So this is her," Priscilla said, not to Eleanor, but to the Duchess, as though Eleanor were a piece of furniture being delivered to the wrong address.
"I confess, I expected someone taller." Eleanor kept her chin level, and her hands folded in front of her, the way her mother had taught her before she died.
"Never let them see you flinch," her mother used to say. "A flinch is an invitation." She did not flinch. "Lady Eleanor," the Duchess said at last, her voice cool as the marble beneath their feet. "Welcome to Blackmore. I trust the journey was not too exhausting for someone of your background." The insult was so smooth, so perfectly wrapped in politeness, that a stranger might have missed it entirely. Eleanor did not miss it. She had grown up poor, not stupid. "The journey was fine, Your Grace," she said simply. "Thank you for asking." Nothing more. No apology, no excuse. The Duchess's eyes narrowed slightly, as though she had expected Eleanor to shrink, and was mildly surprised when she did not. Behind them, the front doors of Blackmore Hall opened, and Sebastian Camden, Duke of Camden, stepped out into the daylight. He was tall, with the kind of stillness that came from years of carrying weight no one else could see. His eyes found Eleanor's, and for a moment, something flickered there. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but something that was not cold either. "Lady Eleanor," he said, and offered his arm. "Welcome to your new home." His new home, not their home. Eleanor noticed the difference immediately, and filed it away, the way she filed away every small detail that told her the truth of a situation, whether people meant to reveal it or not. She took his arm, and together they walked up the steps, past the Duchess, past Priscilla, past a line of servants who bowed with practiced precision but would not meet her eyes. Inside, Blackmore Hall was even grander than it looked from the outside. Marble floors stretched in every direction, portraits of long-dead Camdens stared down from the walls, and the air itself seemed to carry the weight of centuries of wealth. Eleanor had grown up in a house with patched roofs and empty stables, and now she was expected to call this place home. She would not let them see how much it frightened her. The wedding itself happened 3 days later, in the Blackmore Chapel, with only a small gathering present. It was not a celebration. It was a transaction, dressed in white silk and lace, and everyone in the room knew it. The Duke needed an heir, and a fresh infusion of connections through Eleanor's father's old political ties. Eleanor's father needed the money that came with the match. Neither Eleanor nor Sebastian had been asked what they wanted. Still, when Sebastian slid the ring onto her finger, his hands were gentle, and when he looked at her, there was no cruelty in his expression, only a kind of tired resignation that mirrored her own. Perhaps, Eleanor thought, that was something to build on. A small thing, but something. That night, alone in the vast bedroom she had been given, far from her husband's own chambers, Eleanor sat by the window and looked out over the Blackmore grounds. Moonlight spilled across acres of manicured lawn, and in the distance, she could make out the shape of the stables, long, low buildings where the Duke's horses were kept. Something in her chest eased slightly at the sight of them. Horses, she understood. Horses had never once looked at her the way the Duchess had, or the way Priscilla had. Horses did not care about bloodlines or bank accounts. They cared about kindness, and patience, and whether or not you had bothered to learn their language. She thought of Hartley Grange, of the horses her family used to keep before the debts took everything, of long afternoons spent riding bareback through fields because there was no money for proper saddles, of the old, half-lame mare named Willow that everyone else had given up on, but who Eleanor had coaxed back into a kind of grace nobody believed possible. She had learned, over those years, that the animals other people dismissed as worthless were often the ones with the most heart. It simply took someone willing to look past the surface to find it. She did not know it yet, but that lesson was about to matter more than she could imagine. The following morning, Eleanor rose early, dressed simply, and made her way down to the kitchens, hoping to find a quiet corner where she might eat breakfast without an audience. Instead, she found the kitchen staff already whispering among themselves, and the whispers stopped the moment she entered the room. "Good morning," Eleanor said, as brightly as she could manage. A young maid, barely older than a girl, dropped a quick curtsy and hurried away without a word. An older cook, a stout woman, with flour on her apron, offered a tight, polite nod, but said nothing either. It was clear that word had already spread through the household about the new Duchess and where she had come from, and it was equally clear that the staff had taken their cues from the Dowager Duchess herself. Eleanor ate alone, at the end of a long wooden table, while the rest of the kitchen carried on around her as though she were invisible. She was used to being poor. She was not used to being erased. Later that day, she wandered the grounds, partly to explore her new surroundings, and partly to escape the suffocating silence of the main house. It was during this walk that she found herself drawn, almost without meaning to, toward the stables. The scent hit her first, straw and leather, and the warm musk of horses, and something in her chest loosened for the first time since she had arrived at Blackmore. She stepped inside and found rows of magnificent animals, sleek coats gleaming even in the dim light, clearly the pride of the estate. At the far end of the stable, in a stall set slightly apart from the others, stood an old gray horse with tired eyes and a coat that had long since lost its shine. He was the only animal not groomed to perfection, the only one whose stall looked as though it received less attention than the rest. Eleanor approached slowly, the way she always did with animals she did not know, letting him see her, smell her, decide for himself whether she was a threat. The horse lifted his head and studied her, with an expression that was somehow both weary and curious. "Hello," Eleanor said softly. "What happened to you?" A voice behind her answered before the horse could. "That's Ash," said a young man, mucking out a nearby stall, pausing his work to look at her properly. He had kind eyes, and dirt smudged across one cheek. Oldest horse in the stable, used to belong to the late Duchess, before she passed. Nobody's ridden him in years. He's slow now, bit lame in the back leg. Most folks here think he should have been put out to pasture ages ago. Eleanor reached out and let Ash sniff her hand, then gently ran her fingers along his nose. He leaned into her touch, just slightly, the way a creature does when it has not felt real kindness in a very long time. "He doesn't look like he's given up," Eleanor said quietly. The young man, whose name she would later learn was Daniel Cross, gave her a curious look, as though he were seeing something in her that he had not expected to find. "Most folks don't bother looking that closely," he said. Eleanor smiled, the first real smile she had allowed herself since arriving at Blackmore. "I've always found," she said, "that the ones everyone gives up on are usually the ones worth paying attention to." She did not know, in that quiet moment in the stable, that those words would soon become far more important than she could have guessed. She did not know that Priscilla Vane was already, at that very hour, sitting in the drawing room with the Dowager Duchess, discussing the upcoming Camden hunt, and planning exactly how they intended to use it to remind the new Duchess of her place. All Eleanor knew, standing there with her hand resting on Ash's graying neck, was that for the first time since stepping out of that carriage, she finally felt something close to peace. It would not last long. That evening, at dinner, the full weight of Blackmore's hierarchy made itself clear. The dining room was enormous, the table long enough to seat 30, though only 5 place settings had been laid. Sebastian sat at the head, Eleanor to his right, the Dowager Duchess to his left, and Priscilla and her brother Edmund Vane rounding out the small gathering. Conversation moved around Eleanor rather than through her, as though she were a decorative addition to the table rather than a participant in it. When she did speak, offering a comment about the beautiful grounds or asking a polite question about the history of the estate, her words were met with thin smiles and quick redirections back to safer topics, usually involving people and places Eleanor had never heard of and was clearly not meant to understand. "Tell me, Eleanor," Priscilla said at last, swirling the wine in her glass with practiced elegance. "Do they hunt much? Where you're from? I imagine the countryside estates are rather modest compared to what we do here." The insult was calculated, precise, delivered with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Eleanor met her gaze steadily. "We hunted when we could afford to keep horses fed," she said, which admittedly was not always. "But I learned to ride before I learned to read, if that answers your question." Sebastian's mouth twitched, the smallest hint of amusement crossing his face before he schooled it back into neutrality. The Dowager Duchess's expression did not change at all, though her eyes lingered on Eleanor a moment longer than necessary. "How resourceful," Priscilla said lightly, though the word carried an edge sharp enough to draw blood. "You must show us your skills sometime. We do have the annual Camden Hunt coming up. Perhaps you'll join us." "I would be honored," Eleanor said, refusing to let the challenge in Priscilla's voice unsettle her. She had no idea, in that moment, just how carefully that invitation had been designed, or how much it would come to matter in the weeks ahead. All she knew was that she would not give these people the satisfaction of seeing her afraid. Later that night, walking back to her chambers alone, Eleanor passed by a window overlooking the stables and paused. In the moonlight, she could just make out the shape of Ash standing quietly in his stall, patient and unnoticed, exactly the way she herself had felt since the moment she arrived. She did not yet know that fate had already begun weaving their stories together, that the old horse everyone had dismissed and the new Duchess everyone had underestimated were about to become far more alike than either the Dowager Duchess or Priscilla Vane could ever have imagined. For now, she simply whispered a quiet goodnight to the darkened window and went to bed, bracing herself for whatever Blackmore Hall had waiting for her next. Morning at Blackmore Hall arrived with a chill that seeped through the stone walls, and Eleanor woke to the sound of rain against her window. She lay still for a moment, listening to the unfamiliar house settle around her, before rising to face whatever the day intended to throw at her. She had learned, in the short time she had been at Blackmore, that survival here required more than politeness. It required watching, listening, understanding the currents beneath the surface before they pulled her under. So far, she had counted 3 distinct forces working against her. The Dowager Duchess, who ruled the household with quiet, absolute authority. Priscilla Vane, who wielded charm like a weapon and rarely missed an opportunity to remind Eleanor of her lower birth. And the servants, who took their cues from both women and treated Eleanor accordingly, with distant, careful courtesy that never once felt warm. Sebastian remained the one unknown variable in all of it. She found him that morning in his study, bent over a stack of papers, a furrow between his brows that suggested whatever he was reading brought him no pleasure. He looked up when she knocked lightly on the open door, and something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, but a softening. "Lady Eleanor," he said, setting down his pen, "you're up early." "I've never been one for lying in bed," she said. "Old habits. On the farm, the animals didn't care what time the sun decided to rise. If they were hungry, they let you know. And are you hungry now?" he asked, a note of dry humor in his voice that surprised her. "Curious, mostly," she admitted. "I wanted to ask about the estate. I've barely seen any of it beyond the house and the stables." Something flickered across his face at the mention of the stables, though Eleanor could not quite place what it was. Not displeasure, exactly. More like memory, sharp and unwelcome. "The estate is yours to explore," he said finally. "Blackmore has belonged to my family for generations. There is a great deal of history here, some of it good, some of it less so." He did not elaborate, and Eleanor did not push. She had learned already that Sebastian Camden was a man who guarded his grief the way other men guarded gold, carefully, privately, and with no interest in sharing the burden. "I noticed one of the horses in the stable," she said instead, choosing her words carefully. "An older gray gelding, Ash, I believe he's called." For the first time since she had arrived at Blackmore, real emotion crossed Sebastian's face, quick and unguarded before he caught himself, and smoothed it away. "Ash belonged to my first wife," he said quietly. "Charlotte, she adored that horse, rode him everywhere, even when the estate manager insisted a duchess ought to have something finer beneath her." A faint, sad smile touched his mouth. "She never listened to anyone's opinion about what she ought to have. It was one of the things I loved most about her." Eleanor said nothing, sensing that this was not a story that wanted interruption. "After she died," Sebastian continued, his voice quieter now, "I couldn't bring myself to sell him, or retire him properly, or do anything at all, really. He simply stayed. Nobody rides him now. I suppose it felt disrespectful to let anyone else try." "I wasn't planning to ride him," Eleanor said gently. "I only wanted to know his story." Sebastian studied her for a long moment, as though recalculating something in his mind. "You're not at all what I expected," he said finally. "Is that a compliment or a complaint, Your Grace?" "I haven't decided yet," he admitted, and for the first time, something like real warmth touched his eyes. It was a small moment, barely worth noticing to anyone watching from the outside. But for Eleanor, it felt like the first true crack in the wall Sebastian had built around himself since arriving at Blackmore. She left his study feeling lighter than she had in days, though she was careful not to let that lightness show on her face when she passed the Dowager Duchess in the hallway. The Duchess, predictably, did not return the courtesy of pretending not to notice her. "You were with my son," the Duchess said, not quite a question. "I was asking about the estate," Eleanor replied evenly. "How industrious of you." The Duchess's gaze swept over Eleanor with the same cool assessment she had offered on the first day, as though searching for flaws and finding them everywhere she looked. "You would do well to remember, Lady Eleanor, that being married to a duke does not make you a duchess in truth. That title is earned through years of understanding this family, this estate, and the responsibilities that come with both. Your father's debts bought you a ring. They did not buy you respect." The words landed exactly where they were meant to, sharp and precise, but Eleanor had spent her whole life absorbing blows without letting them show on her face. "Then I suppose I shall have to earn it myself," she said simply, and continued walking, leaving the Duchess standing in the corridor with an expression that might have been surprise, or might have been the first flicker of something more dangerous. That afternoon, restless and unwilling to spend another hour trapped inside the suffocating walls of the main house, Eleanor made her way back to the stables. Rain had softened to a light drizzle, and the air smelled of wet earth and hay, familiar scents that reminded her of home in a way the grand halls of Blackmore never could. Daniel Cross was there again, this time repairing a bit of loose fencing near Ash's stall, and he looked up with a friendly nod as she approached. "Back again, Your Grace?" he asked, though there was no mockery in the title, only genuine curiosity. "Please, just Eleanor is fine," she said, "at least when it's only the two of us." Daniel's eyebrows rose slightly, but he did not argue. "Suit yourself. Eleanor, then." He gestured toward Ash, who had ambled to the front of his stall at the sound of her voice. "He remembers you. Horses don't forget kindness, even from a single visit." Eleanor smiled and reached out to stroke the old horse's nose, and Ash leaned into her palm with the same trusting weight he had offered the day before. "The Duke told me about his history," she said quietly. "About the late Duchess." Daniel's expression grew more somber. "Lady Charlotte. Aye. Terrible thing. What happened? She was thrown from a different horse, not this one, out on the Eastern Trail. Ash was in his prime then, and she loved him something fierce, but it wasn't him that day. Still, His Grace couldn't bear to look at him for a long while after. Now it's more that nobody quite knows what to do with him. Too old to sell, too tied to memory to retire proper. So he just stays. That seems like a lonely way to live, Eleanor murmured, more to herself than to Daniel. Aye, Daniel agreed. Reckon he'd understand loneliness better than most creatures on this estate. Eleanor said nothing more, but something settled in her chest as she stood there in the quiet stable, rain pattering softly on the roof above them. She understood loneliness too. She had understood it long before she ever arrived at Blackmore, in the years after her mother died and her father grew distant beneath the weight of debts he could not escape. She understood what it meant to be present in a place but somehow invisible within it. Perhaps that was why she felt such a pull toward this tired old horse, dismissed and forgotten by everyone, except a stable hand, with a kind heart, and a fading memory of a woman who had loved him. She spent an hour there that afternoon, simply sitting near Ash's stall, talking quietly to him, about nothing in particular, the way she used to talk to Willow back at Hartley Grange. She told him about the cold marble floors of Blackmore Hall, about the Dowager Duchess's sharp tongue, about Priscilla's poisoned smiles. She told him things she would never have admitted to another living person, and Ash simply listened, the way good horses always did, without judgment, without agenda, without the constant political calculation that seemed to govern every human interaction inside the main house. By the time she finally rose to leave, the ache in her chest had eased slightly, replaced by something that felt almost like resolve. She did not yet know about the conversation happening at that very moment, in the Dowager Duchess's private sitting room, where Priscilla Vane sat across from Margaret Camden, a china teacup balanced delicately in her hand, discussing the details of the upcoming Camden hunt, with far more enthusiasm than the topic usually warranted. "She rides, apparently," Priscilla was saying, a satisfied curl to her lips. "Claims to have learned before she could read. How charmingly rustic." "Let her ride, then," the Dowager Duchess replied coolly, setting down her own cup with deliberate precision. "The hunt will do what neither of us has managed to do in a week. It will remind her, quite thoroughly, of exactly where she stands in this family." "And which horse did you have in mind?" Priscilla asked, though the gleam in her eyes suggested she already knew the answer. The Duchess's smile, when it came, held no warmth at all. "I believe," she said slowly, "that old grey gelding has been idle for far too long. It seems only fitting that our new Duchess should be the one to finally put him to use." Neither woman could have known, in that quiet, calculated moment, just how badly their plan was about to unravel, or how thoroughly the horse they had chosen to humiliate Eleanor with would instead become the very thing that changed everything. For now, the scheme was set, the invitation already extended, and somewhere out in the rain-soaked stables, Eleanor Hartley sat quietly beside an old, forgotten horse, unaware that the two of them had just been chosen, together, to become the center of a plan designed to break them both. She would learn of it soon enough. And when she did, she would not run from it. She would ride straight into it. Hartley Grange had never been a grand place, even in its better years, but Eleanor's memories of it carried more warmth than anything she had found so far inside the polished halls of Blackmore. She had been 7 years old the first time her father lost a parcel of land to a bad harvest and a worse debt, and by the time she turned 12, the Hartley stables held only a fraction of the horses they once had. Her father sold the fine ones first, the ones that fetched the best price, keeping only the animals nobody else wanted. It was, Eleanor often thought later, a strange kind of education, growing up surrounded by creatures other people had already given up on. Willow had been the first horse truly hers, an old bay mare, with a swayed back and a limp nobody could quite explain. The previous owner had planned to have her put down, calling her more trouble than she was worth, but Eleanor's father, softer-hearted than his circumstances allowed, had taken her in instead, more out of pity than any practical sense. Eleanor remembered the first afternoon she had climbed onto Willow's back. No saddle, no bridle, beyond a simple rope. 7 years old, and utterly fearless, in the way only children can be. Willow had stood perfectly still, waiting, as though she understood that this small girl needed her to be patient. "You have to listen to them before they'll listen to you," her father used to say, standing at the paddock fence with his pipe unlit in his hand, watching his daughter learn a skill he himself had never quite mastered. "Horses know within the first minute whether you respect them or whether you're just trying to use them. Willow there, she's decided she likes you. That's worth more than any fine saddle." Eleanor had taken those words to heart in a way that shaped the rest of her childhood. While other girls her age learned needlework and etiquette, preparing for marriages that would lift their families out of whatever misfortune had befallen them, Eleanor spent her afternoons in the paddock, learning the particular language of overlooked animals. She learned that a horse favoring one leg was not necessarily unable to run, only unable to run the way it once had, and that with patience, a rider could find a new rhythm that worked with the limitation instead of against it. She learned that fear in a horse's eyes rarely meant weakness. More often, it meant a memory of old cruelty that had never been properly undone. By the time she was 16, Eleanor could coax a full gallop out of horses the local stable hands had written off entirely, simply by taking the time to understand what each animal needed, rather than what tradition dictated they should be given. She rode without fear across the roughest parts of Hartley land, through hedgerows and over fallen logs, on horses nobody else would have trusted with the task, and she never once fell, because she never once forced an animal to do something it was not ready for. It was, she often thought, the one true skill she possessed, that had nothing to do with her family's declining fortune, or the marriage that would eventually be arranged to save it. It was hers alone, earned through patient afternoons and quiet understanding, and no one at Blackmore Hall, with all its wealth and pedigree, could take it from her. She thought of all this on the third morning after her conversation with Sebastian in his study, as she made her way once again toward the stables before the rest of the household had fully woken. The rain from the previous days had cleared, leaving the grounds fresh and green beneath a pale morning sky, and Eleanor found herself walking with more purpose than she had allowed herself since arriving at Blackmore. Daniel was already there, as he seemed to be every morning, tending to the horses with the quiet devotion of someone who genuinely loved his work, rather than merely performing it for wages. "You're becoming something of a fixture out here," he said, not unkindly, as she approached Ash's stall. "Is that a problem?" Eleanor asked. Daniel considered the question seriously, the way he seemed to consider most things. "Not for me," he said finally. "Might raise a few eyebrows among the staff, though. A duchess, spending her mornings with the stable hands instead of the sitting room. Then it's fortunate I've never cared much for sitting rooms," Eleanor replied, and Daniel laughed, a genuine sound that seemed rare enough at Blackmore to feel like a small gift. She spent that morning, and several mornings after, simply being present with Ash. She did not attempt to ride him, not yet. Instead, she groomed his coat, cleaned the neglect from his hooves, and spoke to him in the same quiet tones she used to use with Willow all those years ago. She noticed, gradually, small changes. His eyes grew less dull. His ears, once perpetually flattened in what Eleanor recognized as learned resignation, began to prick forward with something like curiosity whenever she entered the stable. "He's healing," Daniel observed one morning, watching Ash nudge Eleanor's shoulder in search of the apple she often brought from the kitchen. Whatever that means for a horse his age. "It's not about age," Eleanor said, running her hand along Ash's neck. "It's about being seen. He's been invisible for a long time. Same as me, if I'm honest." Daniel gave her a curious look, but said nothing, and Eleanor did not elaborate further. Some truths were better left unspoken, even to someone as kind as Daniel Cross. It was on one such morning, nearly 2 weeks after her arrival at Blackmore, that Priscilla Vane happened to be riding past the stables on her way to visit a neighboring estate, and caught sight of Eleanor standing beside Ash's stall, her hand resting familiarly on the old horse's neck. Priscilla reined in her own magnificent black stallion, a horse named Thunder, that had cost more than most of Eleanor's family's entire estate had once been worth, and studied the scene with narrowed eyes. "How touching," she called out, not bothering to dismount. "Bonding with the family relic, are we?" Eleanor did not startle, though her heart gave an unpleasant lurch at the sound of Priscilla's voice. "Ash is good company," she said simply. "Ash is an old, broken-down animal that should have been put out to pasture years ago," Priscilla said, her tone sweet as poison. "But I suppose it makes sense. Broken things do tend to find each other." The insult landed exactly as intended, sharp and cruel beneath its veneer of casual observation. But Eleanor had grown accustomed to Priscilla's particular brand of cruelty in the short time she had known her, and she refused to give the other woman the satisfaction of a visible reaction. "Is there something you needed, Priscilla?" she asked instead, her voice perfectly even. Priscilla's smile widened, though it did not reach her eyes. "Only to remind you that the Camden hunt is approaching quickly. 3 weeks now, I believe. I do hope you're preparing properly, whatever that might mean, for someone of your particular background." "I'll manage," Eleanor said. "I'm sure you will," Priscilla replied, in a tone that suggested she believed nothing of the sort, before nudging Thunder forward and riding off toward the main road, leaving a faint cloud of dust and an unmistakable sense of foreboding in her wake. Daniel, who had overheard the entire exchange while pretending to busy himself with a nearby saddle, waited until Priscilla was well out of earshot before speaking. "She's planning something," he said quietly. "The way she looks at you. The way she keeps mentioning the hunt. That's not idle conversation, Eleanor. That's a woman setting a trap." Eleanor nodded slowly, her eyes still fixed on the cloud of dust settling on the road where Priscilla had disappeared. "I know," she said. "What are you going to do about it?" Eleanor turned back to Ash, who nuzzled gently against her shoulder, patient and trusting in a way that steadied something anxious in her chest. "I'm going to do what I've always done," she said quietly. "I'm going to prepare properly, exactly like she suggested. Just perhaps not in the way she expects." Over the following days, Eleanor's visits to the stables grew longer, though she was careful to keep them discreet, arriving before dawn and leaving before the house fully woke, mindful of Priscilla's watchful eyes and the Dowager Duchess's network of informants among the staff. She began, slowly and carefully, to introduce Ash to the idea of being ridden again, starting with nothing more than sitting quietly on his back while he stood still in his stall, allowing him to grow accustomed to her weight and presence before asking anything more of him. Daniel assisted where he could, holding a lead rope during those first tentative walks around the paddock, offering quiet encouragement as Ash took his first uncertain steps beneath a rider after years of standing idle. "He remembers how," Daniel said one morning, watching as Ash moved with surprising steadiness despite his slight limp. "Look at him. He remembers exactly how." "He never forgot," Eleanor said softly, patting the old horse's neck. "He just needed someone to ask properly." It was slow work, careful work, the kind of patient effort that could not be rushed no matter how quickly the Camden hunt approached. But with each passing day, Eleanor felt Ash's confidence returning, felt the old, tired resignation in his eyes, replaced gradually by something sharper, more alert, almost eager. She did not tell Sebastian about these morning sessions, uncertain how he might react to seeing another rider atop the horse that had once belonged to his late wife. She did not tell the Dowager Duchess or Priscilla either, for reasons that required no explanation at all. She told no one, in fact, except Daniel, who kept her secret with the quiet loyalty of someone who had clearly grown to admire the new Duchess far more than the rest of the household seemed willing to allow themselves. And so, in the weeks leading up to the Camden hunt, a quiet transformation began taking shape within the walls of Blackmore's stables, unseen and unsuspected by the very people who believed they had already orchestrated Eleanor's downfall. They believed they had chosen a broken horse to humiliate a woman they considered beneath them. They had no idea they had instead brought together two souls who had spent their entire lives being underestimated, and who were now, together, quietly preparing to prove exactly how wrong that underestimation had always been. The invitation, when it finally came, arrived with all the ceremony the Dowager Duchess could summon, delivered not privately, but in front of the entire household at dinner, 3 days before the Camden hunt was set to begin. Blackmore Hall had filled considerably over the preceding week, as guests began arriving from across the county for the celebration that traditionally accompanied the hunt. Lords and Ladies Eleanor had never met filled the guest chambers, their carriages crowding the drive, their voices filling the halls with a kind of bright, careless laughter that made the house feel, for the first time since Eleanor's arrival, almost lively. She had met most of them briefly over the preceding days, polite introductions offered by Sebastian at the Duchess's insistence, though Eleanor sensed clearly that these introductions were less about welcoming her into society, and more about giving the assembled nobility ample opportunity to assess, and, inevitably, judge her. Lord Edmund Vane, Priscilla's older brother, proved to be a quieter, more thoughtful version of his sister, though Eleanor noted the family resemblance in the sharp, assessing way he watched people, as though calculating their usefulness before deciding how much attention they deserved. Lady Cordelia Ashby, an elderly widow with a reputation for gossip sharper than any blade, had spent a full 10 minutes interrogating Eleanor about her family's history before losing interest entirely once she confirmed there was no scandal worth repeating. A handful of younger lords, friends of Sebastian's from his university days, treated Eleanor with the same distant courtesy the rest of the household offered, polite enough to avoid outright rudeness, but careful never to venture into genuine warmth. It was at dinner on the third evening of this gathering, the long table finally filled to something resembling its intended capacity, that the Dowager Duchess rose to make her announcement. "As many of you know," she began, her voice carrying easily across the room, silencing the various scattered conversations. The Camden hunt has been a tradition in this family for over 3 generations. It is, I think, the finest expression of what our estate represents: skill, heritage, the mastery that comes only through generations of careful breeding, both of horse and of rider. A murmur of appreciative agreement rippled through the assembled guests. Eleanor, seated beside Sebastian near the head of the table, kept her expression neutral, sensing already where this particular speech intended to lead. This year, the Duchess continued, her eyes finding Eleanor's with a precision that felt almost theatrical. We have the pleasure of welcoming a new member of the Camden family into this tradition. Lady Eleanor, our newest Duchess, will be joining us for her very first Camden hunt. Polite applause followed, though Eleanor noticed several curious glances exchanged among the guests, clearly aware that something more was coming. Given her unfamiliarity with our stables, the Duchess went on, her tone dripping with false consideration, I have taken the liberty of selecting a mount suited to her particular experience. I believe you are already acquainted with him, Lady Eleanor. Ash, I believe, has been rather taken with your recent attention. The words landed like a blow, precisely calculated to humiliate. Eleanor understood immediately what had happened. Someone among the staff, likely one of the grooms less loyal than Daniel, had reported her morning visits to the stable, and the Dowager Duchess had seized upon that information with obvious delight. A ripple of poorly concealed amusement passed through several of the guests. Priscilla, seated further down the table, wore an expression of pure satisfaction, her eyes bright with anticipated triumph. Ash? Lord Edmund repeated, a faint smile playing at his mouth. Isn't that the old grey gelding? The one that's been retired for years? The very same, the Duchess confirmed, though I understand Lady Eleanor has already been quite dedicated in preparing him. Such devotion to an animal most of us had rather forgotten. Charming, really. The word charming, delivered with such cutting emphasis, made its true meaning unmistakable to everyone present. This was not a compliment. It was a public humiliation, dressed carefully in the language of kindness, and every person at that table understood it perfectly. Eleanor felt Sebastian go very still beside her, his jaw tightening in a way that suggested he, too, recognized the cruelty behind his mother's words, though he said nothing, and Eleanor understood without needing to be told that challenging his mother publicly, in front of an entire assembly of guests, was not a battle he felt prepared to fight, not yet, not for a marriage he still barely understood. She could have protested. She could have pointed out the obvious unfairness of assigning the estate's oldest, most neglected horse to a rider expected to compete against the finest mounts in the county. She could have demanded a proper animal, one suited to actual competition rather than public spectacle. Instead, she smiled, calm and composed, and said only, "Thank you, Your Grace. I look forward to it." The Duchess's expression flickered, just slightly, a small crack in her otherwise perfect composure, as though she had expected protest, or tears, or some visible sign of the humiliation she had so carefully orchestrated, and found instead only quiet, unreadable acceptance. Priscilla, less patient than her aunt, could not resist pressing further. "How brave of you," she said sweetly, raising her wine glass in a mock toast. "Most riders would consider such an assignment rather beneath them. I do hope Ash remembers how to keep pace, even at the back of the party." "I'm sure he'll manage," Eleanor replied evenly, and turned her attention deliberately back to her plate, refusing to offer Priscilla the satisfaction of further engagement. The rest of dinner passed in a blur of careful conversation and forced pleasantries, though Eleanor felt the weight of dozens of curious glances throughout the remaining courses, guests clearly speculating about the new Duchess and the very public humiliation that had just been arranged for her benefit. It was only much later that night, after the guests had retired and the house had finally quieted, that Sebastian sought her out in the small sitting room adjoining her chambers, where Eleanor sat alone by the fire, staring into the flames with an expression that gave away nothing of the turmoil she felt inside. "That was deliberate," Sebastian said quietly, closing the door behind him. "My mother's choice of horse. I should have said something." "Would it have mattered?" Eleanor asked, not looking up from the fire. Sebastian was quiet for a long moment. "Perhaps not," he admitted finally. "My mother rarely changes course once she's decided on something, but I still should have tried." Eleanor turned to look at him then, studying his face in the firelight, searching for the truth behind his words. Why didn't you? Because I've spent the last 3 years avoiding conflict with her, Sebastian said, his voice quieter now, edged with something that sounded almost like shame. After Charlotte died, my mother became the only steady thing left in this house. I let her take control of things I probably shouldn't have, simply because it was easier than fighting her on every small matter. I see now that was a mistake. It's not too late to correct it, Eleanor said. Sebastian met her gaze, something shifting in his expression, though Eleanor could not quite name what it was. No, he agreed slowly. I don't suppose it is. He did not offer to intervene on her behalf regarding the hunt, and Eleanor did not ask him to. She understood, perhaps better than he did himself, that this particular battle was hers to fight, and that winning it through her husband's intervention would only prove the very thing the Dowager Duchess and Priscilla wished to believe about her, that she was incapable of standing on her own merit. I don't need a different horse, Eleanor said quietly, turning back to the fire. I need everyone at that hunt to see exactly what Ash and I are capable of. Sebastian studied her for a long moment, something like genuine curiosity replacing the guilt in his expression. You truly believe you can win, riding him? I don't need to win, Eleanor said. I only need to prove that they were wrong to think they could break me by handing me a horse everyone else had already given up on. Sebastian said nothing more that evening, but before he left her chambers, he paused at the door and looked back at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something that resembled genuine respect. 3 days, he said quietly. The hunt begins in 3 days. I know, Eleanor replied, meeting his gaze steadily. We'll be ready. Long after Sebastian had gone, Eleanor remained by the fire, turning over the events of the evening in her mind. The calculated cruelty of the Duchess's announcement, the poorly hidden delight on Priscilla's face, the curious, judging eyes of every guest at that table. She thought of Ash, standing quietly in his stall, growing stronger and more confident with each passing morning, unaware of the elaborate scheme that had made him an unwitting weapon in a battle he had never asked to be part of. She thought of her father, and Willow, and every overlooked horse she had ever coaxed back into strength through patience and quiet belief. 3 days, she thought, staring into the dying flames. 3 days until the Camden hunt, and everything the Dowager Duchess and Priscilla Vane believed they had already won. She closed her eyes and allowed herself, just for a moment, to feel the full weight of what lay ahead. Then she rose, extinguished the fire, and went to bed early, knowing that come morning, there was still work to be done, and precious little time left to do it. The morning of the Camden hunt broke clear and cold, the kind of crisp autumn air that carried the scent of frost and turning leaves, perfect conditions for riding, and perfect conditions, Eleanor thought grimly, for public spectacle. She rose before dawn, dressing in the riding habit that had been provided for her, a fine garment in deep forest green that fit her perfectly, but felt, somehow, like a costume rather than clothing that truly belonged to her. She studied her reflection in the mirror for a long moment before leaving her chambers, searching her own face for any sign of the fear that churned beneath her composed exterior. She found none, only quiet, steady resolve. The stables, when she arrived, were already a hive of controlled chaos. Grooms hurried between stalls, saddling the finest horses on the estate, their coats brushed to a mirror shine, their tack polished until it gleamed in the early light. The air buzzed with excited conversation, guests arriving in 2s and 3s, dressed in their finest hunting attire, greeting one another with the easy familiarity of people who had known each other, and this tradition, their entire lives. Eleanor made her way through the crowd toward Ash's stall, aware of the curious glances following her progress, whispered comments she was clearly not meant to hear, but heard anyway. Is that her? The one riding the old gray? Poor thing. I hear the Duchess arranged it deliberately. Well, she can't say she wasn't warned about marrying above her station. Eleanor kept her chin level and her pace steady, refusing to let the whispers slow her down or bow her shoulders. She had endured worse than gossip in her lifetime. She could endure this. She found Ash already saddled, standing patiently while Daniel made final adjustments to his tack, his coat brushed carefully, though nothing could disguise the obvious age and wear that set him apart from the sleek, powerful animals surrounding him. Morning, Daniel said quietly, offering her a small, encouraging smile as she approached. "He's ready. Ate well this morning. Good sign." Eleanor reached out and stroked Ash's nose, and the old horse leaned into her touch with obvious familiarity. His ears pricked forward, alert and calm, in a way that would have seemed impossible only a few weeks earlier. "Are you ready?" she murmured, more to herself than to the horse. Ash simply nudged her shoulder, patient and steady, the way he had grown to be during their weeks of quiet morning sessions together. "You're really going through with this," came a voice from behind her, and Eleanor turned to find Priscilla approaching, resplendent in a deep crimson riding habit, mounted already on Thunder, who tossed his head impatiently, eager to be off. "I half expected you to develop a sudden illness this morning. Most sensible women would have." "I'm not most women," Eleanor replied evenly, gathering Ash's reins and preparing to mount. "No," Priscilla agreed, her eyes sweeping over Ash with obvious disdain. "I don't suppose you are." "Well, do try to keep up, at least until the first hedge. I'd hate for you to miss all the excitement entirely." She rode off before Eleanor could respond, joining a cluster of similarly mounted riders near the front of the gathering party, their laughter carrying easily across the cold morning air. Eleanor took a steadying breath and swung up into Ash's saddle, settling into the familiar weight and balance she had practiced so carefully over the preceding weeks. Beneath her, Ash shifted slightly, adjusting to her presence, before settling into a calm, attentive stillness that felt, to Eleanor, like a quiet promise. Sebastian found her then, mounted on his own impressive bay stallion, his expression carefully neutral as he took in the sight of his wife, perched atop the estate's oldest, most neglected horse. "You look ready," he said quietly. "I am ready," Eleanor replied, meeting his gaze steadily. Something flickered in his eyes, respect mingled with what might have been genuine worry. "The eastern trail is difficult," he said. "Hedgerows, a stream crossing, uneven ground near the old mill. If it becomes too much, you needn't push through. No one would think less of you for—" "They already think as little of me as they possibly can," Eleanor interrupted gently. "There's nowhere further down to fall, Sebastian. Only up, from here." He studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, before offering a small nod. "Then I look forward to seeing what you're capable of, Lady Eleanor." The Dowager Duchess called the riders to order shortly after, her voice carrying easily across the assembled crowd of perhaps 30 riders, all mounted on horses far finer than the one Eleanor sat astride. "Welcome," the Duchess announced, "to the annual Camden Hunt. As tradition dictates, the course will take us along the Eastern Trail, through Miller's Wood, across Camden Stream, and finally to the finish at Blackmore's Northern Gate. The first rider to cross that gate claims this year's Camden Cup." A cheer rose from the assembled riders, eager and competitive, and Eleanor felt the collective energy of the crowd shift into something sharper, more focused, the playful anticipation of the morning giving way to genuine competitive intent. She glanced once more at Ash's ears, pricked forward and alert, and felt something settle in her own chest, a quiet certainty that had nothing to do with winning, and everything to do with simply proving what she already knew to be true. "Riders, to your positions," the Duchess called, and the assembled party began arranging themselves at the starting line, the finest horses at the front, eager and impatient, tossing their heads against tightly held reins. Eleanor guided Ash toward the back of the pack, exactly where Priscilla and the Duchess clearly expected her to remain, and settled into position, feeling the old horse's steady breathing beneath her, calm despite the chaos surrounding them. Priscilla glanced back once, her expression a mixture of satisfaction and barely concealed amusement, before turning her attention forward, clearly confident that this particular contest had already been decided before it even began. Lord Edmund, positioned nearby on a handsome chestnut gelding, offered Eleanor a brief, almost sympathetic glance. "Steady hands," he murmured, quiet enough that only she could hear. "Whatever happens today, at least you had the courage to show up." Eleanor offered him a small, genuine smile, appreciating the unexpected kindness amid the morning's careful cruelty. "Thank you, Lord Edmund." The Duchess raised a gloved hand, and silence fell across the assembled riders, 30 horses shifting restlessly beneath their eager riders, the crisp morning air charged with anticipation. "Riders," the Duchess called out, her voice ringing clear across the frost-covered grounds. "On my signal." Eleanor gathered Ash's reins, feeling the old horse's muscles tense beneath her, not with fear, but with something that felt remarkably like readiness, as though he, too, understood exactly what this moment meant. "You remember everything we practiced," she murmured softly, leaning forward slightly. "Just like the mornings in the paddock, nothing more than that." Ash's ears flicked back toward her voice, attentive and calm, and Eleanor felt a surge of quiet confidence replace the last traces of her nervousness. The Duchess's hand dropped. "Go!" 30 horses surged forward as one, hooves thundering against frost-hardened ground, riders leaning into the wind as the Camden hunt began in earnest, the assembled crowd of finely bred mounts pulling quickly ahead, eager and powerful, leaving Eleanor and Ash exactly where everyone expected them to be, at the very back of the pack. But as the pounding hooves faded into the distance and the trail ahead began to wind toward the first hedgerow, Eleanor felt something shift beneath her. A subtle change in Ash's gait, a gathering of strength that had nothing to do with speed and everything to do with patience. She smiled, quiet and certain, and settled deeper into the saddle. The real hunt, she knew, had only just begun. The Eastern Trail wound through Blackmoor's grounds in a long, punishing loop, designed generations ago by Camden ancestors who had valued difficulty as much as tradition. It cut through dense woodland, crossed a swift-running stream, and climbed a series of rolling hills before finally descending toward the northern gate that marked the finish line. Eleanor had studied the course carefully in the days leading up to the hunt, walking sections of it on foot whenever she could manage a quiet moment away from the house, memorizing the particular challenges each stretch presented. She knew, better than most of the riders now thundering ahead of her, exactly what lay in store. The first hedgerow appeared less than a mile into the course, a tall, thick barrier that had claimed more than a few riders in Camden hunts past. Eleanor watched from her position at the rear as the leading riders approached it at speed, their horses gathering themselves for the jump. Most cleared it easily, their finely bred mounts sailing over the obstacle with practiced grace. But near the middle of the pack, a young Lord Eleanor did not recognize misjudged his approach, and his horse balked at the last moment, throwing its rider sideways into the hedge itself, amid startled cries and a flurry of scrambling limbs. The rider emerged shaken but unhurt, cursing colorfully as he struggled to remount his skittish horse, several other riders slowing briefly to check on his welfare before continuing on. Eleanor guided Ash toward the hedge at a measured pace, neither rushing nor hesitating, and felt the old horse gather himself beneath her, with the same steady confidence he had shown during their practice sessions in the paddock. He cleared the jump cleanly, landing with a slight stumble on his weaker leg that made Eleanor's heart lurch with worry. But he recovered his stride within a few strides, pressing forward without complaint. "Good boy," she murmured, patting his neck. "Just like we practiced." Ahead, the pack had begun to string out along the trail, the fastest riders pulling further into the lead, while others settled into a more measured pace, conserving their horses' energy for the challenges still to come. Priscilla rode near the front, Thunder's powerful stride eating up the ground effortlessly, her crimson riding habit a bright splash of color against the autumn landscape. Eleanor remained near the back, though she noted with quiet satisfaction that Ash's breathing remained steady and unlabored, his stride settling into the same rhythm she had spent weeks coaxing out of him during their early morning sessions. The trail began climbing then, a long, gradual ascent through Miller's Wood that Eleanor knew from her walks would prove far more taxing than it initially appeared. The finest horses in the pack, bred for speed on flat ground and elegant jumps over manicured hedges, began to struggle against the uneven terrain, their powerful but unpracticed legs finding poor purchase on the root-strewn path. Eleanor watched as one rider after another slowed their pace, their mounts breathing hard, sweat already darkening their fine coats despite the cool morning air. These were horses accustomed to shorter, more controlled exercise, animals pampered and groomed for appearance rather than genuine endurance, and the sustained effort of the climbing trail was beginning to reveal exactly that weakness. Ash, by contrast, seemed to find something like familiarity in the challenging terrain, his steady, unhurried gait perfectly suited to the uneven ground. Eleanor recognized the pattern immediately, the same quality she had noticed in Willow all those years ago. A horse built not for flashy speed, but for patient, sustainable strength, the kind of endurance that revealed itself only over distance and difficulty rather than in short, showy bursts. She began, gradually, to close the gap on the riders ahead of her, not through any dramatic surge of speed, but simply through steady, consistent progress, while others faltered around her. By the time they crested the top of Miller's Wood, Eleanor had moved from the very back of the pack to somewhere in its scattered middle, passing 3 separate riders, whose horses had slowed to a labored trot, their breath coming in visible clouds against the cold air. One such rider, a stout middle-aged Lord Eleanor, recognized vaguely from dinner the previous evening, glanced at her with obvious surprise as she passed. "Didn't expect to see you up here," he called out, not unkindly. "Neither did I, if I'm honest," Eleanor replied, offering him a small smile before continuing forward. The trail leveled briefly, before descending toward Camden Stream, and it was here, Eleanor knew from her scouting walks, that the true test of the day would begin. The stream ran swift and cold this time of year, swollen from recent rains, its banks steep and slippery with fallen leaves. Riders would need to cross carefully, finding secure footing for their mounts before continuing on toward the final stretch. Ahead, Eleanor could see several riders slowing their approach to the water, their horses skittish and uncertain at the sight of the rushing current. One rider, a young lady Eleanor did not recognize, struggled to control her mount as it reared slightly, spooked by the sound of rushing water and the slick, uncertain footing along the bank. Eleanor guided Ash toward the crossing with the same measured patience she had used throughout the ride, letting him approach the water at his own pace, trusting the instincts she had spent weeks cultivating between them. Ash paused at the water's edge, testing the current with careful, deliberate steps, before finding solid footing and beginning his crossing without hesitation. Eleanor felt a surge of pride swell in her chest as they emerged on the far bank, dry and steady, while behind them, several finer horses continued to struggle with the crossing, their riders growing increasingly frustrated. She realized with some surprise, no longer near the back of the pack at all. Somewhere during the climb and the crossing, without any dramatic burst of speed, she had steadily worked her way toward the middle of the field, passing rider after rider whose magnificent horses simply lacked the patient endurance that Ash possessed in abundance. Ahead, she could just make out Priscilla's crimson habit, still near the front of the pack, though Thunder's powerful stride had noticeably slowed compared to the explosive pace he had shown at the start of the race. Even the finest horses, Eleanor knew, eventually paid the price for early speed, unmatched by genuine stamina. She settled Ash into a steady, rhythmic canter, conserving what remained of his energy for the final stretch of the course, the long open field that led toward Blackmore's northern gate. She thought of her father's words, spoken so many years ago at the Hartley paddock fence, about patience and understanding, and the particular value of animals other people had already given up on. She thought of the Dowager Duchess's cold, calculated smile as she announced Eleanor's mount for the day, so certain of the humiliation that assignment would bring. She thought of Priscilla's poisonous words at the starting line, so confident in her own victory that she had barely bothered to hide her amusement. And she smiled, quiet and fierce, as she guided Ash toward the final stretch of the Camden Hunt, no longer at the back of the pack, no longer invisible, no longer underestimated. The real contest, she knew, was only just beginning. The final stretch of the Camden Hunt opened into a wide, rolling field, bordered by ancient oak trees, their branches heavy with the last golden leaves of autumn. It was here, Eleanor knew from her scouting walks, that the true character of a horse and rider would finally reveal itself, away from the tricky footing of the woods and the uncertain crossing of the stream, in open ground where speed and endurance mattered more than careful navigation. She could see the scattered field of riders ahead of her now, strung out across the landscape in a loose formation that told its own story. The early leaders, riders who had pushed their horses hard from the very start, now showed clear signs of fatigue, their mounts' strides shortening, their breathing labored despite the relatively flat terrain. Ash, by contrast, moved with the same steady rhythm he had maintained since the crossing, his breathing controlled, his stride lengthening now as the ground beneath them grew more forgiving. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, feeling the old horse gather himself beneath her. "This is where it matters," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Everything we practiced, everything you remembered, Ash's ears flicked back at the sound of her voice, and Eleanor felt his stride lengthen further still. The old resignation she had first noticed in his tired eyes, weeks ago, now replaced entirely by something fierce and determined. They passed another rider, a young man whose handsome bay gelding had clearly given everything it had during the early stretches of the race, and now had little left to offer. He glanced at Eleanor with visible surprise as she moved past him with apparent ease, though he said nothing, too focused on coaxing what remained of his own horse's flagging energy. Ahead, Eleanor spotted Lord Edmund, his chestnut gelding maintaining a steady, sustainable pace that suggested he, too, understood something about pacing that many of the more flamboyant riders had ignored entirely. He glanced back as she approached, and his expression shifted from mild surprise to something like genuine admiration. "Well," he called out as she drew alongside him, "it seems the old gray has more fight in him than anyone anticipated." "He always did," Eleanor replied, and pressed forward, leaving Edmund and his chestnut gelding behind, as Ash's confident stride carried them further up through the scattered field. The northern gate was visible now in the distance, a stone archway marking the finish line, though Eleanor knew there remained one final challenge before they reached it, a low stone wall that bordered the last stretch of open field, requiring a clean jump that had claimed careless riders in Camden Hunt's past. She could see Priscilla ahead now, Thunder's powerful stride still impressive despite the visible strain of the long ride, the crimson of her riding habit unmistakable even at this distance. Priscilla glanced back once, and Eleanor saw her expression shift from confident satisfaction to something sharper, more calculating, as she registered exactly how much ground the supposedly hopeless Duchess had managed to close. "Impossible," Priscilla muttered, loud enough that Eleanor, drawing steadily closer, could just make out the word carried on the wind. Eleanor said nothing, saving her breath and her focus for the challenge that remained ahead. She could feel Ash tiring slightly now, his breathing growing heavier after the sustained effort of the ride, but there remained a steady determination in his gait that spoke of reserves few had believed he still possessed. "Almost there," she murmured softly, patting his neck. "Just the wall, and then we're done, whatever happens after." The stone wall loomed larger with each passing stride, and Eleanor felt her heart pound with something that was equal parts fear and exhilaration. She had practiced jumps with Ash during their quiet mornings together, smaller obstacles in the paddock, designed to rebuild his confidence gradually, but nothing quite so imposing as this, nothing with quite so much riding on a clean landing. Ahead, she watched as two riders approached the wall in quick succession. The first cleared it cleanly, if a little roughly, his horse stumbling slightly on landing before recovering its stride. The second, a rider whose mount had clearly given everything it had during the earlier stretches of the race, refused the jump entirely at the last moment, forcing the rider to circle back and attempt again, losing precious time and position in the process. Eleanor guided Ash toward the wall with the same measured confidence she had maintained throughout the ride, refusing to let her own nervousness communicate itself to the horse beneath her. She had learned, over years of working with overlooked animals, that hesitation from a rider often created the very failure that rider feared most. "Trust me," she whispered, feeling Ash's ears flick back toward her voice one final time. Just like every morning in the paddock. Ash gathered himself beneath her, and Eleanor felt the powerful surge of muscle as he launched into the jump, clearing the stone wall, with a grace that seemed almost impossible for a horse of his age and history, landing cleanly on the far side without so much as a stumble. Eleanor laughed aloud, a sound of pure exhilaration that surprised even herself, patting Ash's neck enthusiastically as they continued toward the final stretch. "Good boy," she called out. Good boy." Ahead, only a handful of riders remained between them and the northern gate. Priscilla, still leading the diminished pack, glanced back again, her expression now openly alarmed as she registered exactly how close Eleanor had drawn. "This isn't possible!" Priscilla shouted, though whether the words were meant for Eleanor or simply for herself, Eleanor could not say. "He's not the same horse you dismissed weeks ago," Eleanor called back, unable to resist the small satisfaction of the moment. "Perhaps you should have looked more closely before deciding what he was worth." Priscilla's only response was to dig her heels sharply into Thunder's flanks, urging the tired stallion into one final desperate burst of speed, But Eleanor could see clearly now what weeks of careful preparation had built between herself and Ash, a bond and understanding that no amount of raw natural talent could replicate on its own. The northern gate drew closer with each passing stride, and Eleanor felt something settle deep in her chest, a quiet, fierce certainty that had nothing to do with proving anyone wrong, and everything to do with the simple, powerful truth of what patience and belief could accomplish, even in the face of deliberate cruelty designed to break them both. She leaned forward, urging Ash into one final surge of speed, and felt the old horse respond with everything he had left, his tired body finding one last reserve of strength that Eleanor suspected had been waiting, patient and hidden, for exactly this moment. The gate loomed ahead, close enough now that Eleanor could make out the assembled crowd waiting at the finish, servants and guests who had chosen not to ride, but had gathered instead to watch the hunt's conclusion, their faces turning one by one toward the unexpected sight of the Duchess and her supposedly worthless horse, closing the gap on the race's presumed victor. Eleanor felt her heart pound with something fierce and unstoppable, and she leaned lower over Ash's neck, whispering words of encouragement that only he could hear, as the final stretch of the Camden hunt unfolded before them, the outcome no longer nearly as certain as it had seemed only an hour before. The northern gate stood perhaps a quarter-mile ahead, a stone archway framed by the last golden light of the autumn morning, and Eleanor could feel every heartbeat of the final stretch pounding through her own chest, as clearly as she felt it beneath her, in the powerful, determined rhythm of Ash's stride. Priscilla had pulled slightly ahead again, Thunder responding to her desperate urging with one final surge of speed, but Eleanor could see clearly now what weeks of pampered comfort had cost the magnificent stallion. His powerful legs, bred for elegance rather than endurance, had begun to show the unmistakable signs of genuine exhaustion, his once effortless stride growing choppy and labored beneath the sustained demand of the long course. Ash, by contrast, seemed to find new strength with each passing stride, as though the old horse understood, in whatever way horses understood such things, exactly what this moment meant, not just for himself, but for the woman who had spent weeks patiently rebuilding the confidence that years of neglect had stripped away. "Come on," Eleanor breathed, leaning low over his neck, feeling the wind rush past her face as they closed the gap on Priscilla's flagging stallion. "Just a little further. I know you have it in you." They drew alongside Thunder as the two horses approached the final quarter mile, and Eleanor caught a glimpse of Priscilla's face, no longer wearing its earlier expression of confident satisfaction, but something far more desperate, almost panicked, as she registered exactly how close the supposedly hopeless Duchess had drawn. "This is impossible," Priscilla gasped, her breath ragged from the exertion of pushing her tired horse forward. "You cannot possibly." "Watch me," Eleanor called back, and urged Ash forward with a final burst of encouragement, feeling the old horse respond with everything he had left, drawing ahead of Thunder by a length, then two, then three. The crowd gathered at the northern gate had grown louder now, their voices carrying across the open field as they registered the unexpected shift in the race's outcome. Eleanor could hear scattered cries of astonishment, gasps of disbelief, and beneath it all, growing steadily, something that sounded remarkably like genuine excitement. She did not look back to see how far behind Priscilla had fallen. She kept her eyes fixed forward, on the stone archway drawing closer with each powerful stride, on the finish line that represented so much more than simple victory in a hunting competition. Ash's breathing had grown heavy now, his sides heaving with the effort of the sustained final push, but his stride never faltered, never wavered, carrying them both forward with a determination that seemed to defy every assumption anyone at Blackmore had made about his worth. "Almost there," Eleanor whispered, tears stinging unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, though whether from the rushing wind or something deeper, some overwhelming swell of emotion she had not expected to feel, she could not quite say. "Almost there, my brave boy." They crossed beneath the shadow of the northern gate in a thunder of hooves and rushing breath, and the crowd erupted into a roar of astonished applause, the sound washing over Eleanor like something almost physical, a wave of recognition she had never once expected to receive from the people of Blackmore. She slowed Ash gradually, easing him from his final gallop into a walk, feeling his heaving sides beneath her as he caught his breath, His ears pricked forward with what could only be described as pride, as though he, too, understood exactly what they had just accomplished together. Behind them, Priscilla crossed the gate several lengths back, Thunder's magnificent stride finally giving way entirely to exhaustion, the stallion's sides heaving as he came to an unsteady stop. Priscilla sat frozen in her saddle for a long moment, her expression a mixture of disbelief and something that looked almost like genuine shock, as though the very foundation of her understanding of the world had just been quietly, thoroughly upended. The remaining riders crossed the gate in scattered succession over the following minutes, each one greeted with polite applause, though nothing that matched the astonished celebration that had greeted Eleanor's unexpected arrival. Eleanor dismounted slowly, her legs unsteady from the sustained exertion of the ride, and immediately turned to check on Ash, running her hands along his heaving sides, checking his legs for any sign of injury or strain. "You did it," she murmured softly, pressing her forehead briefly against his sweat-dampened neck. "You truly did it." Daniel appeared at her side, almost immediately, his face split into a wide, delighted grin as he took the reins from her hands. "I've never seen anything like it," he said, his voice thick with genuine emotion. "Not in all my years working these stables. Never." Around them, the gathered crowd continued to buzz with astonished conversation, guests and servants alike turning to stare at the old gray gelding and his unexpected rider, with expressions ranging from disbelief to genuine, dawning admiration. The Dowager Duchess stood near the front of the assembled crowd, her face carefully composed, though Eleanor could see, even from a distance, the unmistakable tightness in her jaw, the barely contained fury of a woman whose carefully orchestrated humiliation had backfired so thoroughly and so publicly. Priscilla dismounted slowly, her earlier confidence entirely evaporated, replaced by something that looked distinctly like humiliation of her own, as she registered the murmuring crowd, the astonished glances, the fact that everyone present had just witnessed her carefully planned victory transform into an unexpected, very public defeat. Eleanor did not gloat. She did not seek out Priscilla's gaze or offer any triumphant remark. Instead, she turned her full attention back to Ash, accepting an offered towel from one of the grooms and beginning to gently wipe down his sweat-darkened coat, murmuring quiet words of praise and gratitude that only the old horse could truly understand. It was Sebastian who found her there, still tending to Ash amid the buzzing crowd, his own horse forgotten momentarily as he crossed the field toward his wife, with an expression Eleanor had never once seen from him before, something that looked remarkably like wonder. "Eleanor," he said quietly, stopping just beside her. "That was—" He seemed unable to find the right word, and Eleanor looked up at him, still slightly breathless from the exertion of the ride, her cheeks flushed with cold air and exhilaration both. "That was simply what happens," she said softly, "when someone finally takes the time to see what was there all along." Sebastian's gaze moved from her face to Ash, standing patient and proud beside her despite his obvious exhaustion, and something shifted in his expression, a recognition that seemed to extend far beyond the outcome of a single hunting competition. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly, "for not seeing it myself, for not fighting harder against my mother's cruelty." "You're seeing it now," Eleanor replied simply. "That matters more than any apology could." Around them, the crowd continued to buzz with astonished conversation, the story of the Duke's supposedly worthless bride and her unlikely victory already beginning to spread among the assembled guests, a story that would, Eleanor suspected, travel far beyond the boundaries of Blackmore's estate before the day was through. She had not set out to win the Camden Hunt for glory or recognition. She had set out simply to prove that the people who had dismissed her, and dismissed Ash alongside her, had been wrong to judge either of them by appearances alone. Standing there in the cold autumn air, surrounded by a crowd whose opinion of her had just been fundamentally and publicly rewritten, Eleanor felt something settle deep within her chest, a quiet, hard-won sense of belonging that no amount of inherited title or family fortune could ever have provided. She had earned this moment, every second of it, and she intended to make certain that nobody at Blackmore Hall ever forgot it. News of the Camden Hunt spread through Blackmore Hall with remarkable speed that evening, servants whispering the story to one another as they went about their duties, guests recounting the astonishing race over drinks in the drawing room before dinner, the tale growing slightly with each retelling, though the core of it remained unmistakably true. The Duke's new bride, mounted on an old, forgotten horse everyone had assumed unfit for competition, had ridden past the finest animals in the county to claim an unexpected and thoroughly deserved victory. Eleanor spent the hours following the hunt quietly, first tending to Ash's needs in the stable alongside Daniel, ensuring the exhausted horse received proper rest, food, and gentle care after his extraordinary effort, and later retreating to her chambers to bathe and change, grateful for a few quiet hours away from the buzzing curiosity of the household. She had expected, perhaps, that the Dowager Duchess would confront her directly about the outcome of the hunt, some cutting remark designed to diminish the victory or reassert the natural order the Duchess so clearly believed in. Instead, when Eleanor finally emerged for dinner that evening, the Duchess said nothing at all, her silence more telling than any words could have been, a woman clearly recalibrating her understanding of a daughter-in-law she had badly underestimated. Priscilla, for her part, did not appear at dinner at all, citing a sudden headache that fooled no one, least of all Eleanor, who understood perfectly well what it meant to nurse a public humiliation in private, away from curious eyes. Dinner itself passed with an unusual undercurrent of energy. Guests who had previously offered Eleanor only distant, careful courtesy, now peppering her with genuine questions about her riding, her upbringing, the particular skill she had shown in coaxing such an unexpected performance from a horse everyone had assumed long past his prime. "Where did you learn to ride like that?" asked Lady Cordelia Ashby, her earlier disinterest entirely replaced by genuine curiosity. "I've watched the Camden Hunt for 30 years, and never seen anything quite like it." "My family kept horses others had given up on," Eleanor replied simply. "I suppose I learned, out of necessity, how to see past what an animal looks like on the surface, toward what it might still be capable of, given the right kind of patience." The answer seemed to satisfy the assembled guests, several of whom nodded with what looked like genuine respect, a marked shift from the careful, condescending politeness Eleanor had grown accustomed to since her arrival at Blackmore. It was after dinner, as the guests began drifting toward the drawing room for cards and conversation, that Sebastian found Eleanor slipping quietly away toward the gardens, seeking a few moments of solitude away from the continued attention her victory had brought. "May I join you?" he asked, catching up with her along the gravel path that wound through Blackmore's carefully maintained gardens, the autumn evening cool and clear around them. "Of course," Eleanor said, and they walked together in comfortable silence for a few moments, before Sebastian spoke again. "I've been thinking, all afternoon, about what you said earlier," he began, "about seeing what was there all along." Eleanor glanced at him, curious about where this particular train of thought might lead. "And what have you concluded?" Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "I think," he said finally, "that I've spent the past 3 years so consumed by grief over Charlotte that I stopped truly looking at anything around me, including this estate, including my mother's growing influence over decisions that should have been mine to make, including, if I'm honest, you." Eleanor said nothing, sensing that he needed the space to continue without interruption. "When you arrived," Sebastian went on, "I saw only what my mother had arranged, a marriage of convenience meant to solve a practical problem. I didn't take the time to see the person standing in front of me. That was unfair to you, and I'm sorry for it." "You've apologized already," Eleanor said gently. "This morning, in fact." "I know," Sebastian said, "but I don't think I truly understood, until today, exactly what I'd been failing to see. Watching you ride Ash across that field, watching the two of you accomplish something everyone else believed impossible, I finally understood what my mother and Priscilla never bothered to look for. You're not someone who needs saving, Eleanor. You never were." The words settled over Eleanor with unexpected weight, and she found herself studying Sebastian's face in the fading evening light, searching for any trace of the distant, guarded man she had married only weeks earlier, and finding, instead, something far more open, far more genuine. "I appreciate you saying that," she said quietly. "But I should tell you, I never expected saving. I only ever wanted to be seen clearly, for exactly what I am." "And what is that?" Sebastian asked, his voice soft with genuine curiosity. Eleanor considered the question for a long moment before answering. Someone who understands that worth isn't always visible on the surface, she said finally. In horses, or in people. Sometimes it takes patience and genuine attention to find what's truly there. Sebastian's expression shifted into something that might have been the beginning of real affection, unguarded in a way Eleanor had not seen from him before. I would like to learn to see things that clearly, he said quietly, if you'll teach me. I think, Eleanor replied, a small smile touching her lips, that today was a fairly good beginning. They continued walking through the gardens as the evening deepened around them, conversation flowing more easily between them than it ever had before, touching on subjects far beyond the day's dramatic events. Eleanor's childhood at Hartley Grange, Sebastian's own complicated relationship with his mother's expectations, the quiet grief he still carried for Charlotte, alongside a growing, unexpected hope for whatever might come next. It was not a declaration of love, not yet, but it was something perhaps more valuable, a genuine foundation of honesty and mutual respect that neither of them had expected to find in a marriage arranged for purely practical reasons. As they made their way back toward the house sometime later, Sebastian paused at the garden gate and looked at Eleanor with an expression of quiet determination. Tomorrow, he said, I intend to speak with my mother about the way this household has treated you since your arrival. That ends now. You don't need to fight my battles for me, Eleanor said, though something in her chest warmed at the offer nonetheless. I know I don't need to, Sebastian replied, but you shouldn't have to fight them entirely alone either. Not anymore. Eleanor studied him for a long moment in the fading light, recognizing in his expression the same quiet steadiness she had come to associate with Ash's patient, trusting eyes, a strength that revealed itself not through grand gestures, but through consistent, genuine presence. Thank you, she said softly. They returned to the house together, and though neither spoke of it directly, both understood that something fundamental had shifted between them that evening. A genuine partnership beginning to take root where only cold arrangement had existed before. Somewhere in the darkened stables, Ash stood quietly in his stall, finally receiving the rest and recognition he had deserved for years. An old, forgotten horse who had, in a single remarkable morning, reminded an entire household of exactly what patience, belief, and quiet determination could accomplish, even against the longest of odds. The Camden hunt had ended hours earlier, but for Eleanor and Sebastian both, something far more important had only just begun. The weeks following the Camden hunt brought changes to Blackmore Hall that Eleanor could not have predicted on the cold morning she had first arrived as a stranger in an unfamiliar house. Sebastian kept his promise. The morning after their conversation in the garden, he requested a private meeting with his mother in her sitting room, a conversation Eleanor was not present for, but whose effects became evident soon enough in the noticeably different way the household began treating her. The whispered comments from servants ceased almost entirely. The careful, condescending politeness that had greeted her at every turn softened gradually into something that resembled, if not warmth, then at least genuine respect. The Dowager Duchess herself never offered a direct apology, remaining far too proud a woman for such an admission, but her manner toward Eleanor shifted in small, unmistakable ways over the following weeks. She began addressing Eleanor by name rather than title alone. She occasionally sought Eleanor's opinion on household matters, small things at first, the arrangement of flowers for a dinner party, the selection of music for an upcoming gathering, gradually expanding into matters of greater consequence as her confidence in her son's wife grew. It was not friendship, not exactly, but it was something Eleanor had not expected to find at all when she first arrived at Blackmore. A grudging, evolving respect between two women who had begun as adversaries and were slowly, carefully, becoming something closer to allies. Priscilla proved more difficult to win over. She remained cool and distant in the weeks following the hunt, her wounded pride evidently taking longer to heal than the Duchess's initial hostility. But even Priscilla, Eleanor noticed, gradually softened her sharpest edges, perhaps recognizing that continued cruelty toward a woman who had so publicly proven her worth served little purpose beyond making Priscilla herself appear petty and small. Their relationship never became close, but it settled eventually into a kind of wary civility, occasional polite conversation replacing the pointed cruelty of earlier weeks. A truce neither woman felt the need to discuss openly, but both seemed to understand nonetheless. Ash's transformation continued as well, growing stronger and more confident with each passing week, under Eleanor's continued care. What had begun as a deliberate cruelty, assigning the estate's most neglected horse to its most unwelcome new member, had become instead something entirely different. A partnership built on patience and genuine understanding that neither the Dowager Duchess nor Priscilla could have anticipated when they first devised their plan. Sebastian formalized the arrangement himself several weeks after the hunt, calling Eleanor to his study one afternoon with an expression of quiet satisfaction. "I've spoken with the estate manager," he said, sliding a document across his desk toward her. "Ash is officially yours now. Not merely a horse you've taken an interest in, but your own. Registered properly, cared for, according to whatever arrangements you see fit." Eleanor studied the document with genuine surprise, tracing her finger over the careful script that formalized what had already become true, in every way that mattered. "Thank you," she said softly. "This means more than I can properly express." "He was Charlotte's horse once," Sebastian said, his voice gentle. "I think she would be glad to know he found someone who understood him so completely. I know I am." Eleanor looked up at her husband, recognizing in his expression the same growing warmth that had been building between them ever since that evening in the garden. A genuine partnership taking root where cold arrangement had once existed. "I'd like to think," she said carefully, "that Charlotte and I would have gotten along, had circumstances allowed it." "I think you're right," Sebastian replied, something soft and genuine in his voice. "I think you would have." Word of Eleanor's remarkable ride continued spreading throughout the county in the weeks that followed. The story of the Duke's supposedly worthless bride and her unlikely victory becoming something of a local legend, retold at dinner parties and social gatherings with growing embellishment, though the essential truth remained unchanged. A woman everyone had dismissed, riding a horse everyone had given up on, had proven them all thoroughly, publicly wrong. Eleanor received invitations she never would have expected in her earliest weeks at Blackmore, neighboring families requesting her presence at their own gatherings, curious to meet the woman whose remarkable horsemanship had become the talk of the entire county. She accepted some, declined others, gradually building a genuine social standing that had nothing to do with her husband's title and everything to do with her own demonstrated character. Daniel Cross, whose quiet loyalty and assistance had proven invaluable throughout the weeks leading up to the hunt, found himself promoted to head groom shortly afterward, a position Eleanor had specifically requested on his behalf, recognizing the genuine skill and dedication he brought to his work with the estate's horses. "Never expected any of this," Daniel admitted to her one morning, several weeks after the hunt, as they stood together near Ash's stall, the old horse now thriving under consistent care and attention. "Figured I'd spend my whole life mucking stalls and never get noticed for it." "Good work deserves recognition," Eleanor replied simply. "I only made certain the right people noticed yours." Eleanor's father, upon hearing news of his daughter's remarkable victory, sent a letter that arrived several weeks after the hunt. Filled with pride Eleanor had rarely heard from him during her childhood at Hartley Grange, weighed down as those years had been with the constant burden of debt and diminishing fortune. "You always did have your mother's gift with horses," he had written. "I only wish she could have seen how far you've carried it." Eleanor read the letter several times, tears gathering in her eyes, before folding it carefully and placing it among her most treasured possessions, a reminder of exactly where her particular strength had first been cultivated, long before Blackmore Hall had ever entered her life. As autumn deepened into winter, and the grand halls of Blackmore grew warmer, with the genuine affection slowly building between Eleanor and Sebastian, she found herself reflecting often on the strange, circuitous path that had brought her to this unexpected place of belonging. She had arrived at Blackmore as an unwanted stranger, dismissed by nearly everyone she encountered, assigned deliberately to the estate's most neglected horse in an attempt to break her spirit before she had even properly begun her new life. Instead, she had found in that neglected horse a kindred spirit, another soul overlooked and underestimated by people who judged worth by surface appearance rather than genuine substance. Together, they had proven, thoroughly and unmistakably, exactly how wrong such judgments could be. She thought often, in quiet moments, of her father's words at the paddock fence so many years earlier, about patience, about listening before expecting to be heard, about the particular value found in creatures and people the rest of the world too easily dismissed. Standing now in Blackmore's stables on a cold winter morning, watching Ash graze contentedly in the paddock beyond, his coat gleaming with health, his eyes bright and alert in a way that would have seemed impossible only months earlier, Eleanor understood finally and completely exactly what her time at Blackmore had taught her. Worth was never determined by the assumptions of others. It revealed itself only through patience, through genuine attention, through the quiet, determined refusal to accept the limitations other people tried to impose. She had arrived at Blackmore Hall as the poorest bride ever to marry into the Camden family, given deliberately the oldest, most broken horse the estate possessed. She had left that humiliation so thoroughly behind that nobody at Blackmore would ever again make the mistake of underestimating her, or the quiet, remarkable creature who had carried her, against every expectation, to a victory neither of them had been meant to claim. Together, they had ridden straight past every doubt, every cruelty, every careful assumption designed to break them, and found instead something far more valuable than any Camden Cup could ever represent. They had found, at last, exactly where they belonged,